All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yoel and Sarah Kelman, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Jack Bennett, for dedicating this week's learning in memory of First Sergeant Rafi Zengville, who served as an infantry soldier in the Givati Brigade and was killed by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon on January 25th, 2000. We thank our Day of Learning sponsors, the Haber family, for dedicating the Day of Learning today on the occasion of the first yahrzeit of their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, Aaron Green, Aaron ben Moshe Menachem Zichron Livracha, Jacob and Goldie Milner, for dedicating the Day of Learning in honor of the second yahrzeit for Goldie's Zayda, Max Jacob Moshe ben Elio, who was a pillar of the Baltimore community. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, an anonymous sponsor for the Refuah Shlema for Dr. Aviva Weisbord, Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheinachana, as well as for Rachel Bas Yehudis Gittel, with Nathan and Jesse Franco for dedicating the shir in honor of the first yahrzeit of Nathan's grandfather, Nissim ben Shmuel. We thank all of our sponsors for their dedication, for their generosity. All those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And the neshamas should have an aliyah, the family's einachama. We'll say with that, let us begin. Okay, good. So we'll say, let's go. So today's daf is Tzadik Tes 99, and we are picking up Emeretz Hashem on Tzadik Ches Amud Beis 98b at the Mishnah. Omin Adam B'Shus HaYachid U'Metalta B'Shus Ram. So this is actually a very interesting case. A person could stand in the Rishus HaYachid and move an item in the Rishus Harabim. So we'll say, so just to understand, take a look at this Rashi for just a moment. Omin Adam B'Rishus HaYachid, B'Bayis O Alagag, V'Shocha V'Notel Chayfetz B'Rishus Harabim Kan Umanicho Kam. So imagine the following scene. I'm standing in my house. I have a window. My window overlooks the Rishus Harabim. So what the Mishnah seems to be saying is, I can reach out my window, reach into the Rishus Harabim, and move an object around in Rishus Harabim. Similarly, Birshus Harabim umetaltal Birshus HaYachid. So too, I could stand in Rishus Harabim and reach into the Rishus HaYachid and move something around in the Rishus HaYachid. Ubilvad shelo yotzi chutz me'arba amos. So we'll say with one caveat. The one caveat is that I should not move the item more than Dalit Amos. More than Dalit Amos. Okay, so we'll say, so interestingly enough, what's driving this over here? You see, before you would see this Mishnah, one would have thought that halacha l'maisa, you can't stand in one rishus and move something in a different rishus. What should I be concerned about? I should be concerned about the possibility of maybe taking the item into the rishus. When I think about this, I'm standing in my house, I have a window, I reach into the Rishus Harabim, I move an item around in the Rishus Harabim. And so what happens? I would think I can't do that, lest I come to go ahead and pull the item from the Rishus Harabim into my home, into the Rishus HaYachid. Kamash on the Mishnah says we're not concerned about that. We're not concerned. So therefore you can reach into the Rishus Harabim, move an item around, just don't move it more than Dalet Amos. Next. Lo ya'amod adam b'Rishus HaYachid, v'yashtin b'Rishus Harabim. Person should not stand in a Rishus HaYachid and urinate into the Rishus Harabim, or B'Rishus Harabim v'yashtim B'Rishus HaYachid, or a person shouldn't stand in the Rishus Harabim and urinate into the Rishus HaYachid. So I will say ultimately again, why? Very simple idea, because again, I am transferring the urine, right? The act of urinating from one Rishus to another ultimately goes ahead and I'm transferring an item from one domain to another. Similarly, v'chein lo yorok, you also shouldn't spit from one rishus to another, because ultimately, again, that represents a transference of the item as well. Rabbi Huda Omer, af mishen nitlash rokol befiv, lo yahalich arba amos ad sheker. What's a very interesting halacha? So Rabbi Huda says, not only that, but once the yitlo shabosai literally means becomes dislodged. Once the saliva becomes dislodged in your mouth, you shouldn't walk more than Dalet Amos as well until you spit it out. So we'll say, look at Rashi just a moment. Misha nitlash roko befiv. So we'll say, we're going to see what nitlash means. But what nitlash means on just the most basic level is an accumulation. In other words, we'll say a person always has saliva in their mouth, but at certain points in time, the saliva accumulates into something more substantive. Rabbi Huda says, once the saliva accumulates, you really should not walk around with that, because at that point in time it's considered to be a separate entity than your body, and therefore you should expel it before you go ahead and walk Dalet Amas. Good. So let's analyze all of these cases. Very interesting. Says the Gemara, Masnila Rav Chinina bar Shamya Lechia bar Rav Kamei de Rav. So lo ya'amot, so therefore Rav Chinina bar Shamya taught this Lechia bar Rav in front of Rav. Lo ya'amot adem b'rishos hayachid, u'metaltal b'rishos Rabin. So ultimately, you're going to say they had another brisa, and in this brisa it said a person should not stand in rishus hayachid and move something in the rishus harabim. So both say the brisa contradicts the Mishnah. Amarlei shavkis rabbanon va'avaret k'Rav Meir. You have set aside the position of the Rabbanon, and you have darshan, and you have paskind like Rabbi Meir. Suppose we're going to see this. This is the next Mishnah on Kuf Aleph. Rashi says over Va'avaratak Rabbi Meir Di'ihu the Gazar Shema Yavi Eslo Kilakon Bricker. So we're going to see this discussion, by the way, about standing in one rishus and moving an item in a different rishus is actually subject of Machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon. And the Machlokes, I will say, is a very simple one. Do we allow you to stand in one rishus and move something in a different rishus? What's the concern? The concern is that halacha l'maisa, if we let you stand and let's say rishus yachid and move something in rishus rabin, must we be concerned that you will come to take the item from the domain in which you are moving the item and pull it into the domain in which you are currently situated? That's a machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon. So our Mishnah reflects the view of the Rabbanon, who say we are not concerned about such a possibility, and therefore you could stand in one rishus and move an item in a different rishus. You just can't move it more than Dalet Amas. Rabbi Meir will say, we'll see in the Mishnah on Kuf Aleph, that halacha l'maisa, that is aser. So here, Rav Chinina bar Shamya taught a brisa in accordance with Rabbi Meir, to which Rav says to him, well, you've set aside the position of the Rabbanon and you pass out Rabbi Meir, top of Tzadik Tes, who savar, doomed, that since the Seifa, the latter Mishnah, reflects the view of Rabbi Meir, that this view also reflected the view of Rabbi Meir Velohi, and the Gemara says that's not the case. Seifa Rabbi Meir V'Reisha Rabbanon. The latter Mishnah we'll see is Rabbi Meir. This one is the Rabbanon. So we'll say, so therefore, again, what emerges over here is this Mishnah reflects the view of the Rabbanon, like as we read, namely that halacha l'maisa, you're permitted to stand in one domain and move an item in a different domain, as long as you cap the movement at Dalet Amis or less. As long as you don't move the object Dalet Amis, ha chotzi chayiv chatos. Now, what do you see from here? It sounds like what it's saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, if you were to move the object, so let's say again, let's take the first case. I'm standing in my house, I extend my hand through my window, I move an object in the public domain of Shurabim 5 amas. So it sounds like if I did that, I would be chai b'chatos. I have performed an act of hotzah, or an act of havar, right? I moved an object, dalet amas, ultimately in Rosh Hashanah. So it's like I'm chai b'chatos. To which the Gemara Shabbos said, take a look at Rashi. Ha hotzi, first top line in Rashi. Ha hotzi, achayfetz mi dalet amas chayiv, af al gav dehu omed begavoa v'higbia lemala miyud, ve'viru lo aminan ha'avaras derech makom pturhu, alma basar hanocha va'akira azlinan, v'arinat lo mitchilasar v'nichlasar. So we'll say, so let's understand something. If you're going ahead and standing in your house and reaching into the Rosh Harabim to move an object, or both say, presumably, how is that happening? So remember again, presumably what's happening is you are reaching down, you're lifting up, and you're moving. Now I both say, now understand, the pashtos, when you move that item dalet amis, you are holding it at a height that is lamala miyud. Right? That's just bepashtos. Remember, again, both say 10 tefachim is really not a lot of heights. If you're situated in your house, you can imagine this. Imagine for a moment using one of these grabber things, right? So you grab the item, you lift it up, you extend it out, you drop it down 5 amas later. So we'll say, what are you doing? You're doing an akira. You're uplifting. You're lifting up the item in Shurabim. You're setting it down in Shurabim 5 amas later, 5 amas further, but you're carrying it lamala miyud, which is technically speaking, you're carrying it in an airspace that is not Rosh Hashanah. And yet, again, the Mishnah seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, you would be chai v'chatos for such an act. What do you see from that? Leima misayeh le'rava, dama rava, hama'avir chayfetz mitchilas arba l'sof arba, ve'aviru derech halav chayiv. We'll say we saw this in yesterday's daf as well. This seems to support the idea of Rava, because we'll say Rava says that halacha l'maisa, if you transport an item daled amis and surabim, and you transport it via the airspace, right, of a makom p'tur. In this case, when I say makom p'tur, I mean Rosh Hashanah, right? You go and you transport it via the airspace of lamala miyud, you are still going to be chayiv. So I'll say this Mishnah seems to go ahead and support that idea. Mika tanim hotzi chayiv chatas. No. Tush Gemara says not necessarily. Does the Mishnah say that if you moved the object dalid amis and you carried it lamala miyud, that you are chayiv chatas? Does it say that? It doesn't say that. It just says what? It just says that halacha l'maisa o bilvad shelo yotzi. It says you're not allowed to do it, but it doesn't say you're chayiv chatas. Maybe what it means is im hotzi patra avalaser. We'll say maybe what it just means is that what? That halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead and you moved the object dalad amis, but you transported it through a height that is lamala miyud tfachim, maybe what that means is that halacha l'maisa, that is pater aval aser. Maybe that's what it means. That halacha l'maisa, again, you're not allowed to do it, but if you did it, it is only an iser derabanan. Ika dainer was an alternate version of this ha hotzi pater. So the alternate version is, remember, all the Mishnah says, Rabbi say, is that you are not allowed to move it more than daled amis. The Mishnah doesn't tell me what happens if I do move it more than daled amis, right? That the Mishnah never says. So an alternate version is that you ha hotzi pater, that aval aser, if you move the daled amis, it's aser. I mean, it's your pater aval aser, she's aser derabanan. Lema tevet yufte de Rava. This should be a refutation of Rava. The Amar Rava hama'aver mitchilas dalid l'sof dalid be'aviru derech halav chayiv. Rava says that if you moved an object dalid amis, but you carried it through an airspace that is lamala miyud, that you're still going to be chayiv. Because also remember again, in Rava's world, what matters to us most is what? When will you be chayiv for an act of transporting an object in Rosh Hashanah? When there's an akira, a lifting up of the object in one spot, and a hanocha, placement down in Rosh Hashanah 4 or more amos later. We don't care how the object gets from point A to point B. So you carried it, you threw it. You carried it lamala miyud lamata miyud. Rav said, I don't care. Biblical liability for transporting an object daled amos in Rosh Hashanah comes from an akira and a hanocha. You lifted up the object, it moved, or you moved it 4 or more amos, you are chayiv midda oraisa. So the Gemara says the Mishnah seems to indicate to us that halacha l'maisa, that's not the case. The Mishnah seems to indicate to us that no, if you moved it via lamala miyud, it'll be pater aval aser. To which the Gemara says mikatani hotzi pater aval aser. Does the Mishnah say that if you moved it daled amis, it's pater aval aser? No. Dilma im hotzi chayiv chatos. Maybe again, I say the Mishnah means to say that you're not allowed to carry it, and if you did carry it, and if you did move it, even lamala miyud, you'll be chayiv chatos. Therefore, we'll say, bottom line is the Mishnah is inconclusive regarding this point. So here's what I know. What I know is that if I'm standing in my house and I'm moving the object in Rosh Hashanah, I could do that. I just can't move it more than daled amis. What happens if you did move it down more than daled amis? Chayiv chatos. Is it pater aval aser? So I'll say so that the Mishnah seems to indicate is inconclusive. Lo yamot adam b'rishas hayachid. I'll say similarly again. Listen to this: a person should not stand in Rosh Hashanah and urinate into Rishus Harabim. It's good advice in general, right? But again, I'll say, but l'maisa again on Shabbos, if one were to do so, halacha l'maisa again, that would be an act of hotzah. That would be an act of transferring an item from one domain to another. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef, Hishtin v'rak chayiv chatos. So listen to this. We'll say Rav Yosef says, in fact, if you urinate from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or we'll say vice versa is the same, right? Or from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or you spit from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, you chayiv chatos. We'll say that is an act of hotzah. That is an act of transferring an item from one domain to another. To which the Gemara says, but one second, I'm saying, going back to the beginning of Masech Shabbos, in order to be chayiv for akira and hanacha, the object must be picked up and placed down from a makom chashiv. A makom chashiv, an important area. And halacha defines important area as what? As at least dalit tfachim. So I'll say, so if a person is spitting from their mouth, person is urinating, that's not coming from a makom dalit al dalit. So how can you be chayiv for that? To which the Gemara will say, this is incredible. Machshavto mishavile makom. So we'll say, ultimately, again, one's intent creates a makom chashuv. So look at Rashi just a moment. Machshavto shutzarich lekach mishav yilei hotza chashuva. So let's listen to this. So this is quite fascinating. So essentially what the Gemara is saying is, since this is the place of the normative place of origin for the saliva, for the urine, it becomes a makom chashuv. Even though, again, it doesn't have the dimensions of dalid al dalid, l'maisa, again, it becomes a makom chashuv because this is the normative point of origin. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, you would be chay for an act of hotzah. The Gemara says, because if you don't say this, hada amarava zarak v'nach b'fi hakeler. Also, we saw this case. Person throws an object, and the object comes to rest in their dog's mouth. And also, imagine for a moment, I'm playing catch with my dog on Shabbos, only in Rosh Hashanah. So what happens? I throw the tennis ball to the dog, and it catches it in its mouth 10 amas away. So I will say that's an act that is a biblical prohibition. But one second, the dog's mouth is not dalid al dalid, or for that matter, again, a person goes ahead and throws something. They throw it into pia kivshan, into the opening of an oven, which also is not a makom dalid al dalid. So the Gemara says, chayiv chatas. In this case, you're still chayiv chatas. I v'haba inanachai makom dalid v'leka. But one second, neither of these things, the pia kivshan nor the mouth of the dog, is a makom dalid. So why would I be chayiv? Ela machshavtom b'shav yirei makom. So we'll say, because since it's my intent for the dog to catch the ball, right, or my intent for the object to land in the oven, by definition creates a chashivos for that makom. And we'll say, dalid by dalid is just the objective measurement for a makom chashuv. But if you go ahead and you deem a particular area to be a makom chashuv, then halacha l'maaseh your intent transforms that area to be a makom chashuv. Hachanami machshava mashvilei makom. So we'll say over here, because the normative point of departure for urine and saliva is my body, these areas become a makom chashuv onto their own. So if I will say, so this is very important. So halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara teaches me that halacha l'maaseh, if a person urinates from one domain to another, or spits from one domain to another, that is an act of hotzah on Shabbos. So this is an interesting case. By Rava, hu birshos hayachid, upi ama birshos harabim mahu. What's the interesting case? What happens if a person is standing in Rishos hayachid, but the aver extends into Rishos harabim? Say for Rabosai, so meaning what's happening over here is the actual area where the urine is exiting his body is in a different rishos than the rest of his body. So listen to this. It's an interesting shaila. So the Gemara says, "Ma, what's the halacha? Basar akira azlinan or basar yitzia azlinan?" I will say, do we go basar akira? And I will say, now where does the urine come from? The urine comes from the bladder. The bladder is situated. We'll just say in Rosh Hashanah, because the case over here is the person is standing in Rosh Hashanah, and ultimately again, but the urine is actually exiting his body in Rosh Harabim. So do we say basar akira azlinan? We look at where the urine is dislodged, and the urine comes from the bladder. The bladder is situated in Rosh Hashanah, or basar yitzia azlinan. Or I will say, do we look at the area where the urine exits the body, and ultimately again, that's going to be in Rosh Harabim. So we'll say, what's ta'lacha? We'll say, obviously, the nafkamina is very significant. The nafkamina is, did you violate an act of hotzah or not? To which the Gemara says, teku. To which the Gemara doesn't answer the kasha. Okay, interesting. The lo yarok. So to Rabbi say, a person should not go ahead and spit from one rishus to another. And Rabbi Huda, remember again, Rabbi Huda adds in the Mishnah over here, af misha nitlash roko befiv. As soon as literally again the saliva, nitlash again means dislodged. Once it's been dislodged in the mouth, you should not walk around with it for dalet amis. Rather, again, you should spit it out. Says the Gemara. Let's analyze. Afagav delo hipechba. So we'll say, now this is very interesting. So the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Huda, it seems to be problematic, even though a person was not mahapechba. And I will say, what does it mean hipachba? Hipachba, I will say, means hipach literally means swirl it around. See, I will say, here's what's interesting. That in other words, sometimes a person could have saliva that accumulates in the mouth, but it's just sitting there. Versus hipech is kind of, I don't know what the technical term for this is, but like when you swirl it around in your mouth, like when you prepare yourself to expel it, the act of actively gathering the saliva into a collective pool, right, of saliva. That's hipech ba, right? We're going to see the illustration works much better with phlegm. That's coming, right? It's coming in just a moment. So the Gemara says, take a look at Rashi. Supposed to listen to this. So the Gemara assumes as follows: when you spit, the Gemara assumes like there's two processes. There is the process of the dislodging, what we call the tlisha, but you don't normally spit, you don't normally expel the saliva until after the hipech, until after like you swirl it around and gather it. Yet Rabbi Yehuda seems to indicate to us that a collection of the saliva in one's mouth is problematic even before you swirled it around in your mouth. Well, I have a hotnan. The most ones that we learned. Listen to a fascinating case. So let's listen to this case. I'm eating figs. Now Rashi points out truma figs. So watch this. I'm eating truma figs, but my hands are dirty. Now I will say it doesn't literally mean physically dirty, but rather again it's referring to the idea that, remember, stam yadayim in general. If you don't wash your hands, a ritual washing, hands are considered to be shnios l'tumah. They're considered to have, a secondary level of tumah, which means that if you were to touch truma with them, it could be problematic. So the case in question over here must be as follows. I'm eating figs of truma. Now the case has to be where I didn't necessarily handle the truma with my hands, or the truth is I could have handled it. You'll see why in just a moment. Watch this. So the Gemara says, V'hichnis yado l'soch piv. So then what happens? I go ahead and, as I'm eating the figs, I put my hand into my mouth, litol tsurar, because whatever, let's say in the figs, there was a little pebble or a little splinter that got mixed in, so I'm putting my hands into my mouth to remove something from my mouth. But in the course of it, what happened? I touched the figs. So now watch what's happened over here. I touched the figs, truma, with my hands that are shnios. But remember again, what's happened in the interim over here? This is quite fascinating. So remember again, what's happened over here is the figs have come in contact with my saliva. So the shaila is, does the contact with my saliva make them ra'ui lekabel tuma? Make it ra'ui lekabel tuma. So look at Rashi for just a moment. Actually, not yet. So the Gemara says, what happens? What's halach? Rabbi Meir metame, Rabbi Yossi metar. Rabbi Meir says the figs are tamei. Rabbi Yossi says they're tar. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Meir metame, shari huchshira hatruma barok shebefiv. Rabbi Meir says because again the truma, my saliva is a liquid, one of the 7 liquids, and it made the truma in my mouth roy the kabel tuma. I then put my finger into my mouth, touched the truma, they came in contact with my saliva. Therefore, again, the figs are now tamei. And Rabbi Yossi says no. Rabbi Yossi says that it's tar. Why? Rabbi Yossi's opinion is saliva. It's true that saliva is one of the 7 liquids that can make an object roy the kabel tuma. But when is that? That's when the saliva leaves my mouth. Saliva in my mouth is not a mashke, it's not a liquid, which makes something ro'i lekabel tuma. For Rabbi Yossi mitar, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, hipach ba tamei. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you swirled around if the saliva was swirled. In other words, I will say that like when you gather something in your mouth, if it was swirled around, so then it's considered to be a separate entity. Then einachinami, it can make the figs inside your mouth huksha the kabel tuma. However, lo hipechba, but if you did not swirl the saliva around, then what? Ultimately, again, the figs will be tar. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, muchlefes hashit. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you have to switch around the shitos. Ultimately, again, switch the sheet to Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Yossi. Reish Lakish says no. If you don't have to switch around the sheetas, what's the case here? We're not talking about saliva, we're talking about phlegm. So we'll say that changes everything. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, we learned, Rabbi Huda Omer, kicho v'nitlash. Rabbi Huda talks about, we'll say, the case of phlegm, which became detached. In other words, we'll say once you, once you cough up the phlegm, even before you swirl it, so that by definition becomes something separate and distinct. So the Gemara says, my love rok v'nitlash, does that not also include rok, saliva, as soon as it becomes detached, even before it's swirled? Halach l'maisa is problematic. Lo kicho v'nitlash. No, it only applies to phlegm. Aiva tayim Rabbi Yehuda Omer kicho shenitlash v'chein roko shenitlash. Lo yahalech dalet amos ad shiyarug. But also we have a brisa that says, Rabbi Yehuda says that halacha l'maisa, whether the phlegm became detached or the saliva became detached, you should not walk with it for more than dalet amos until you expel it. Ella nechaberta kidishanina meikar. Brother both say again, it worked better what we said before to switch the shitas of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Fine. So both say. So what comes out over here is that halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda's position really is that saliva, once it becomes detached, apparently even before it's actively swirled, halacha l'maisa again, halacha l'maisa will be problematic. Now also we'll see this halacha in Shulchan Aruch. The truth is the Rambam paskins, at least by Tumas Ochlin, that saliva. Let's take the case of truma. That at least by the case of truma, saliva doesn't become a mashke, doesn't become a liquid capable of being machshir something kabel tuma until the saliva ultimately, again, is what the Gemara calls swirled. Or if it's just in your mouth, because there's always saliva in my mouth, if it's just in my mouth, it does not become a liquid that is capable of making an object ra'i lekabel tuma. But if it's kind of swirled, which means it becomes an entity unto itself, even though again it's still in my mouth, under those circumstances, it can make the object ra'i lekabel tuma. Good. Amar Reish Lakish. Listen to this. Also, once we spoke about spitting, kiach bifnei rabba chayev misa. Both say if you go ahead and you spit in front of your rebbe, you are chayev misa. Both say. Now remember, kiach is literally phlegm, right? So if you spit phlegm, you spit in front of your rebbe. So bifnei rabba chayev misa. So the Gemara says, Shinei Marcos, the pasuk says. So the Gemara quotes over here the pasuk from Mishlei. Kol nisanai ahavu maves. We'll say the pasuk literally means all those who hate me. Hakadosh Baruch Hu saying all those who hate me love death. But the way we darshan it is al tikri lemisanai ella lemasni'i. Those who cause me to be despised. So we'll say so. Ultimately, the Gemara says over here. The Gemara says the act of spitting in front of one's rebbe is such a profound act of disrespect. It reflects so poorly on a Talmid Chacham. Instead, I will say someone who does this is Chaim Misa because it's not really the affront that he delivered to his Rebbe. It's the affront to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That here the Talmid Chacham is supposed to be the ambassador of the Ribono Shel Olam. And yet he's acting in such a base fashion. He causes HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be despised. So the Gemara says, Vaha meinas anis, but I don't understand. But at the end of the day, it's an onus. In other words, they both say that halacha l'maisa, if a person has phlegm in their mouth, a person has saliva, that they don't ask for that. That just happens. To which the Gemara says, no. Kiach v'rak kamiran. They both say if a person like coughs up phlegm, that's not the problem. That's not the problem. What's the problem? Is when you spit it out in front of your Rebbe. That's ultimately again when the Gemara has such harsh words for such an individual. Okay, so I'll say so incredible. So I'll say let's go back a little bit. So lo ya'amod adam b'shas yachid. Say so we're gonna lump these two mishnayos together in terms of the halacha l'maisa because both of them deal with the same topic, namely of standing in one domain and doing something in a different domain. So we'll see the Shulchan Aruch on both of them together. Mishnah. Lo ya'amod adam b'shas hayachid v'yishter b'shas haram. So we'll say a person should not stand in the Rishas HaYachid and drink in the Rishas HaRabim. Or Bershas HaRabim v'yishter b'shas Yachid. Or stand in the Rishas HaRabim and drink in the Rishas HaYachid. Ella imkein hechnis rosha v'ruba l'makom shushosa v'chein begat. Rather, I will say, if the only way you should drink in a different domain is if your head and the majority of your body extends into that domain. What's the concern of your Rebbe say? The concern over here is that if you're going ahead and standing in Rosh Hashanah and you have a cup of wine in the Rosh Hashanah and you bend your head into Rosh Hashanah, the concern is that you are just going to naturally, even just reflexively, bring that cup back with you into the Rosh Hashanah, thereby engage in the act of Hotzah. Therefore, says the Mishnah, you could stand in one domain and drink in a different domain, as long as your head and the majority of your body is in the domain in which you are drinking. V'chein begat. The Mishnah says the same thing with a wine press. We'll see exactly what that means. Says the Gemara, Reish Rabban of Sefer Rabbi Meir. So we'll say it seems to be over here. Remember, the last Mishnah allowed me to stand in one domain and move an item in a second domain. This Mishnah now, we'll say, is seemingly not allowing me to do that. So it seems to be the earlier Mishnah was the Rabbanon. This Mishnah seems to reflect the view of Rabbi Meir, who takes some more restrictive. And I just want to point out, we have not seen the position of Rabbi Meir. That's going to come on Daf Kuf Aleph. The Gemara says, Am Rav Yosef bechafetzin shetzrichan lo b'divrei hakol. No, but say this case is different. Look at Rashi. B'chafetzin says shetzrichan lo. It's the first wide line in Rashi in the bottom. Afilu Rabbanan modu d'gazer b'hu d'mitoch shutzarch lam yachnisim etzlo hilchach mashkin alol tzrichan lo v'gazrinan. Both say, even the Rabbanon who allow you to stand in one domain and move an object in a different domain will agree that when you're dealing with what we call a necessity, something that you're actively utilizing and need, there is a concern that you may come to transport it from one domain to another. So we'll say in the case of drinking, where I'm actively drinking something, even the Rabbanon will agree, we don't want you just putting your head in the Rosh Hashanah and drinking like that, because there's a major concern that you'll come to transport the liquid, the cup, into your domain where you're standing in. It's only if you have rosh over rubo, your head and the majority of your body in the domain in which you are drinking, we no longer have a concern that you're coming to transport. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, up until now, we've been framing these cases with the Rosh Hashanah. What about the case of a Carmelis? So we'll say, what happens if a person is standing in a Carmelis and he's drinking in Rosh Hashanah? Now, both say, now remember again, what does Carmelis do for us? Carmelis is a din d'Rabbanan, right? So remember again, in the case of the Mishnah, I'm standing in Rishus HaYachid and drinking in Rishus HaRabim. So there's a real concern that if I come to move my cup of wine into Rosh Hashanah, I've done an actual act of hotzah. What happens if I'm standing in a Carmelis and drinking in Rosh Hashanah or drinking Rosh Hashanah? Supposed to remember again, what's my worst case scenario? If I transport an item, the worst case scenario is what? An Isser d'Rabbanan. Not downplaying it, but that's the extent. That's the extent of the fallout of this. So does the same halacha as espoused in the Mishnah apply? Amar Abaye, he. So Abaye says yes. Halacha l'maisa, we don't change anything. Right? Ultimately, again, whether you're standing in a Carmelis, standing in a Rosh Hashanah, it doesn't make a difference. The halacha is the halacha. When you're drinking, in order to stand in one domain, drink in a different domain, you must have the majority of your head and body in the domain in which you are drinking. Amar Rava, he gufa gzeira, v'anar neikov v'nigzar gzeira l'gzeira. So Rava says no. Come on. Carmelis itself is a gzeira. And now you're going to add on an additional gzeira on top of that gzeira. So Amar Abaye Menamin Sabai says, from where do I know that even a Carmelis, the same halacha of the Mishnah applies, Mediktani Amadeis, V'chin Begat. Because Rabbi say the Mishnah also says the same halacha applies in a wine press. And Rabbi say, Abaye will say, now what is the Mishnah adding when it says so too in a wine press? Abaye suggests the wine press is a case of a Carmelis. The wine press is a Carmelis, and therefore Abaye says the Mishnah says not only does this halacha apply from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, but it even applies in a Carmelis as well. But Rava Amar says no. The case of Gat, Rabbi says, is also coming to teach us a different halacha. Le'inyan Meiser. Rabbi says is actually quite fascinating. The case of the Gat has nothing to do with Shabbos, but rather has to do with Meiser. What does that mean? Meiser. This Rabbi says is fascinating. Shosin al Hagat. So we'll say, let's get a little bit of background to this. The halacha is that, well, look at Rashi. Shosin al Hagat. Rashi says, Omid al Hagat, you can stand by the wine press. V'shosa. The chozman shelo hitziu lochotz lav shtias kevahu upater min hamaiser bein shemazgo becham bein shemazgo b'tzor. Listen to this. The halacha is, generally, an object is only chayiv in shumas and meisers when the object has reached its finished state. When is wine considered to be in its finished state? When you remove it from the wine press. So I will say, technically speaking, if you drink wine in the press, right? In other words, you're standing in the wine press. I don't mean literally inside of the. I mean you're standing in the area of the wine press, in the Carmelis of the wine press. If you drink there, that's called shtiyas arai. That's called just like a snack, and therefore, again, technically speaking, you're not chayiv in shumas and maisros. It's actually quite fascinating. So the Gemara says this nan shosna lagas. You can go ahead and drink wine from the wine press. Ben bechamin ben bitzonin upatir mir. Whether you're diluting the wine with warm water, cold water, we'll see why that distinction is important in just a moment. So halacha l'maisa, if you drink by the wine press, you're not chayiv in Trumas Maisrus. That's called Shtiyas Harai. Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok mechayiv. Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok says you're chayiv. You're chayiv. In other words, that even going ahead, once you go ahead and dilute it, because most remember again in the wine press, they were making wine concentrate. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok says once you dilute wine, then it is considered to be a finished product. Even if you are drinking it in the wine press itself, it's finished. Then prachayiv and shumas ma'is. The Chum say alacham and chayiv v'alatzon and pater. So say interestingly enough, the Chachamim say that halacha l'maisa, if you diluted it with warm water, ultimately again now the wine is chayiv and shumas ma'is. But if you diluted it with cold water, you are pater from shumas ma'is if you're drinking it in the wine press. Why? When they shemachzer is very interesting. Because apparently, when people would drink in the wine press, if you would go ahead and dilute it with cold water, and you didn't finish your wine, what would you do? You'd pour it right back into the press. You just would pour it back to the rest of the concentrate. But once you dilute it with warm water, apparently, again, I guess for the fermentation process, you can't put warm water back into the pool of the press. So interestingly enough, Chum say, if you diluted it with cold water, you're not chayiv in shumas ma'is, because it's understood that whatever you don't finish, you can pour back. You diluted it with warm water. Once you do that, it's a finished product, and you're chayiv in shumas ma'is. So therefore, Rava will say that halacha l'maisa, this case of the gat has nothing to do with Shabbos. It's actually a discussion regarding trumas and maisrus. And ultimately, again, when you're considered to have a finished product or not, the Mishnah, according to Rav, the Mishnah is teaching me that if you drink wine in the press, halacha l'maisa, again, it's still called an unfinished product, and therefore not subject to trumas and maisus. But again, then we see a some machlokes. Abaye says, God comes to teach me karmelis, that drinking in a karmelis is no different than drinking a shtiach rabim, and Rava says it's about trumas and maisus. Good, so we'll say so machlokes about that case as well. Let's go weiter a little bit. Mishnah. Koleit adam min hamaschila, lemat mi tfachim, uminat sinar mikol makom shosas. So we'll say, now watch this. This is picture, coming to the end of the pictures over here. So we'll say, so this is picture. This is picture 346, 347, 348. So we'll say, so the Mishnah says over here, we're going to see the maschila is a gutter. So as I say, I have a gutter that runs by my roof line. So the Mishnah says over here that what could I do? I could collect water from the maschila lemata miyud. So we'll say, you can see in the picture over here, I'm standing in Rosh Hashanah, and I'm catching the rainwater as it comes off the gutter, and I'm catching it within 10 tefachim of the ground of Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say, so again, so therefore I'm effectively catching the rainwater in the Rosh Hashanah itself. Lamatinu tefachim. Uminat tzinar, but I will say ultimately again from the tzinar. So the tzinar, I will say you could see over here is, uminat tzinar. Tzinar is picture 347. This is more like it's a pipe as opposed to a gutter. This is more like a drainage pipe. So the halacha is by a drainage pipe. I will say mikol makom shos. From a drainage pipe, you could collect the water directly. I will say that's the picture you see over here. The individual is collecting the water straight from the pipes, as opposed to the gutter. I'm holding the bucket within 10 tefachim of the ground of Rosh Hashanah, right? But from the tzinor, I could go ahead and collect the water directly. The Gemara says, and Rashi points out, you could even put your mouth on the drainage pipe if you want and drink directly like that. All right, so what's going on over here? Says the Gemara, kolate in aval metzarei flow. So what's interesting over here is as follows. Apparently, by the case of the gutter, there are two different terms over here. There's what's called kolate. Kolate means to catch falling water in the bucket. That's the picture you see. Mitzaref means to put your mouth or to put the bucket right by the opening of the gutter or by the gutter. So the Mishnah is very clear. I can hold the bucket as long as it is within 10 tefachim of the ground of the Shram to catch the rainwater coming off the gutter. What can't I do? I can't hold my bucket right by the edge of the gutter. So the Gemara says, what's the pshat? Collate in, so we'll say I could catch the water, aval metzarei flow, but I can't put my bucket right by the gutter. My time, what's the reason? Rav Nachman hacha b'maschila pachos migimel samach lagagaskin. Because we're talking about a gutter that's less than 3 tefachim off the roof. So we'll say it's interesting. their gutters are not like our gutters, right? So we'll say our gutters, right? Gutters are usually attached right to the edge of the roof line. You could see, Rabbi say, in the picture over here, you could see in 346, the gutter it's not attached at the edge of the roof. It hung a little bit below. So it's the same concept, right? The water would go ahead and flow off the roof into the gutter, but the gutter was, so what's the case over here? The case over here is where the gutter is within 3 tefachim of the roof. The chol pachos migimel samach lagag dami, because we'll say, remember again, less than 3 tefachim is lavud. The roof is a reshus hayachid. So to take water directly from the gutter with my bucket and then bring it under Shabbat would supposed to be what? Be an act of hotzah. So therefore, I'm allowed to catch the water as it comes out of the gutter in my bucket, as long as my bucket is within 10 tefachim of the gutter. But I cannot put my bucket up to the gutter. The gutter is less than 3 tefachim of the roof. The roof is reshus hayachid, and Halacha Lamai said that would be an act of hotzah. Taina, everybody said that supports this. Omein adam reshus hayachid, a person can stand in reshus hayachid. Umakbia yado lemala me'asar tefachim, and a person could go and lift up his hand above 10 tefachim. Lefachos mishlosha samach legag, within 3 tefachim, close to the roof. V'koleit, and you could collect water as long as you don't go ahead and put your hand directly there. Tanya idach, another brayso that supports this. Lo yama other b'reshus hayachid. Person should not stand in reshus hayachid v'yagbia yadu l'malam me'asar tefachim, and lift your hand above 10 tefachim. Lefachos migim samach lagag v'yitzaref aval kolei tu v'shos. I suppose it's the same brayso, saying the same idea. That halacha l'maisa. Therefore, again, I can catch water coming off the gutter. That's not a problem. But to put my bucket up to the edge of the gutter that is within 3 tefachim of the roof, which therefore I will say essentially makes the gutter like a reshus hayachid, that I can't do. Good. Minatzina mikabakum shosa. So we'll say, but yet again from the drainage pipe, I could even drink that. Which sounds like I could put my mouth on the drainage pipe. I could put the bucket right by the drainage pipe. Tana im yesh betzina dalet al dalet asum. We'll say, however, again, now both said the drainage pipe is different because you can see from the picture, the drainage pipe is not really, that water is coming from somewhere else. So ultimately, again, it doesn't have the problem of being attached, of being like loved to the roof. So because of that halacha l'maisa, I can go ahead and take water directly from the drainage pipe with one caveat, the Gemara says, im yesh betzino dalet al dalet aser. If the drainage pipe itself has an area of dalet al dalet, 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, then it's going to be problematic. Why? Because we'll say essentially, if the drainage pipe itself has a dimensions of dalet al dalet, then halacha l'maisa, the problem is it becomes like an act of hotzah to go ahead and put your mouth right on it, or to go ahead and put the bucket right on it. Good. One more. So let's begin the next Mishnah. I have a pit in Reshus Hayirabim, and I will say again, it's so the pit with its embankment is 10 tefachim high. Okay, so we'll say back to the days of bar. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Chalon shal gabal malanim and b'Shabbos. So we'll say, so imagine the scene. This is a water pit. So right, so the water pit is 10 tefachim, and I live right next door to the pit. So we'll say I have a window that opens up into the pit. So what's the halacha? I could draw water from that pit on Shabbos. Okay, Ashba. If there is a garbage dump next to my house that is 10 tefachim high, well, say, what could I do? If the garbage dump is 10 tefachim high, and I have a window that opens there, I could dump out wastewater or garbage from that window into the garbage dump on Shabbos. Okay, says the Gemara, I'm asking, and so we'll say, what's the case over here? Focusing on the case of the water pit. If you want to say that the water pit is right next to my home, so we'll say, which means there's less than dalet tefachim in between my home and ultimately again the pit, then what? The Gemara says, then lama lichuya yod. So we'll say, so why do you have to? In other words, we'll say if there's less than dalet tefachim in between my pit and the home, then obviously I could draw water from it. What's the case? The case is where the water pit is more than 4 tefachim away from my home, from my house. And we'll say the reason I can draw from the water pit is why? Because the water pit itself is a reshus hayachid, right? So we'll say ultimately again, because the water pit because the water pit itself has a bank, ultimately again of 10 tefachim, because it's all 10 tefachim, therefore I'm allowed to draw from it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu tema besmucha hakam ashon debar b'chol yosem mitzarfen l'asrav. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, we'll have to stop with this. Rabbi Yochanan says, the novelty that's being expressed here, we'll say, is something different. The novelty that's being expressed here is that halacha l'maisa, when creating a water pit that is a reshus hayochid, you could go ahead and combine the depth of the pit and the height of the embankment. So we'll say that's the novelty that's being expressed over here. That even if you have a pit, let's say that's only 8 tefachim deep, but the embankment adds on an additional 2 tefachim, then that pit will ultimately be considered to be a reshus harabim, or reshus hayachid, because of the combination of the depth of the pit and the height of the embankment. Right, so we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with the case of the garbage dump in Meretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. Have a good day.
Baruch atah Adonai